Greetings to everyone. Welcome to In Vino Veritas, brought to you by the Napa Institute. We're coming to you from our 14th annual summer conference in sunny Napa, California. I'm your host, Mark Rohlena, Napa's Executive Director. We launched this podcast a bit ago to bring you a sense of the good going on in the church. At Napa, and very visibly at our summer conference, we're reminded of so much good going on in the church. We get a chance to see people dedicating their lives to build up Christ's body, amazing apostolates, great priests, and religious, wonderful lay faithful supporting such great work. You have enough outlets focusing you on the negative and the seemingly hopeless. We want to give you reasons for hope. How did your lives connect with Blessed Stanley's life? Is it, and what did that mean to you?
Yeah, at the time that I first heard of Stanley Rother, I was just beginning my third year of theology at Mount St. Mary's Seminary when got word a few weeks before we returned to seminary that this distinguished missionary alumnus of the seminary had been slain in Guatemala. I'd never heard of him before, at least that I had recalled. But upon return to the seminary a few weeks later, everyone was abuzz with talk of this heroic alumnus, and began to hear more and more about him as stories were shared. And it was a big news story because it was an American priest slain during a civil war, and why was he slain, and all of those kind of questions were Time Magazine, New York Times, everybody was kind of talking and writing about it. But what I came to recognize very quickly was that he was kind of an apolitical figure. I mean, he was just an ordinary parish priest. He wasn't caught up in liberation theology or he was just trying to serve his people. And that's what inspired me as a seminarian, had a tremendous impact in giving me a real example of ordinary priestly holiness, sometimes called to do extraordinary things.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I suppose a person could have one of two reactions. If that's part of the deal, maybe I'm not so interested, or a moment of courage, which we want to get into sort of that vocational influence where Blessed Stanley might help even today. But Bishop Mueggenborg, how about you? You might have had maybe even shared some space with him during his life.
And I would say, like Archbishop Coakley, I only learned about his life after his death. His personal influence in my life did start a few months before his martyrdom. I was a college freshman, 18 years old, and was really running from the idea of being a priest in my own life. So, my aunt and uncle asked me if I would serve Mass for their 50th wedding anniversary, and I reluctantly agreed to do it. And it was held in that small church of Holy Trinity in Okarche. Again, I didn't know Blessed Stanley Rother at that time. I didn't even know what he looked like. But he actually was a concelebrant in that Mass. And when he came into the sacristy, he had a presence about him that I had never encountered in my life. And it was a distinctive spiritual presence. And I was captivated by that. And all through the Mass, I kept praying about why he had that presence that I wanted in my life, but I wasn't finding it. And he had it as a priest. And it was during that Mass that I decided to be open to being a priest again. And only after the Mass that I asked my parents, who was that? And they said, that's Father Stanley Rother. He's the missionary in Guatemala. So I allowed myself to be open to a vocation following that experience. But again, it wasn't until his death on July 28th of 1981 that I began to aggressively study his life and to learn about why he was, someone who had that spiritual presence. I really believe that he was living a Eucharistic priesthood that was a sacrificial witness of love for Jesus and for his people. And that's what inspired me to be a priest. I think we need those heroic examples of sacrificial priesthood to remind us what it means to be a friend of Jesus in today's world. And he did that for me. And that was very inspirational and very encouraging. And I began praying for his intercession on the very day of his martyrdom.
Yeah. It's interesting to say that, you went into that sacristy trying to run away, and then, the grace, maybe his intercession brought you closer to the decision to explore the priesthood.
Now, it took a few years for that
Sure,
to happen.
sure.
I mean, there were some other roadblocks that had to be overcome, and certainly the experience had to come to maturity. But all the way through my seminary experience, I kept a photo of him as part of my desk arrangement, and I would continue to turn to him and pray, that I would be able to have the same fortitude, the same courage, the same faith, the same commitment. And so I pray that those graces, have been received and are being lived.
Yeah, it's amazing. Let's break down some of the story a little bit. Blessed Stanley wasn't the best student, at least in some subjects. Is that right? I understand maybe he struggled in Latin, which gives hope to many Latin students across the country.
That's correct.
Yes.
He was a good high school student, but he was very much involved in FFA and Future Farmers of America, and I think that's what the future he had envisioned for himself. But when he finally realized, as he was finishing high school, that maybe the Lord was calling him to be a priest, he found that he hadn't adequately prepared, at least according to the standards of the time. When he went to seminary in San Antonio, Texas, he had not studied Latin, and he managed to persevere for a couple of years, and finally they invited him to seek another vocation because he was failing in his, not because he was subpar as a student, as an intellect, but he just didn't have the preparation. So he left at that time, but the bishop at the time, Bishop Victor Reed, believed in him, and Stanley was really convinced that the Lord was calling him to be a priest. And the bishop said, "Well, let's see if we can find another seminary for you," and called Mount St. Mary Seminary and spoke with the rector there, Monsignor George Mulcahy, and they took him, and he went to Conception Seminary in college in Missouri for a few months that summer to try to bone up on his Latin and prepare himself a little bit better to start anew. And at Mount St. Mary in Emmitsburg, he really flourished. He had to learn to limit his outside extracurricular activities. This guy was so talented in so many ways, fixing things and stuff like that, everybody was asking him, hey Stan, can you give me a tune-up on my car? I'm getting ready to drive home and stuff like that. Or he started a printing press, or a bookbindery rather, in the seminary. But he could do anything with his hands, but he needed to channel his energy in different ways in order to be a successful seminarian. And ultimately, he succeeded.
Sure.
And the remarkable thing, of course, is what he accomplished when he finally went to Guatemala. This kid who had flunked out because he couldn't pass basic ecclesiastical Latin, found himself involved in this rather significant, momentous project of translating the New Testament from a Mayan dialect and translating, the Word of God.
That's amazing.
Remarkable.
Yes. Yeah. Well, a lesson in perseverance for sure. And either of you can maybe speak to this. What was the relationship? Why did the diocese have a connection with Guatemala? Why was this even a possibility for Blessed Stanley to connect with?
Well, in the years after Vatican II, I think it was Pope John the 23rd invited the churches in North America to consider sharing their resources with the very poor churches of Latin America, not only financial resources, but human resources as well. And so they began inviting dioceses in the United States and perhaps elsewhere to adopt a sister diocese in Latin America. I was a priest of Wichita. Our diocese had a sister diocese in Venezuela. In Oklahoma, they adopted a diocese and a parish in particular in Guatemala. And so that was the connection between the two local churches in Oklahoma and Guatemala.
Okay. And at the time, when they decided that that's the location, there wasn't a level of unrest that eventually would become fatal for Blessed Stanley, but...
Exactly. It was pretty stable. I mean, it was a lot of corruption and things like that, and dire poverty, but the civil wars hadn't broken out yet.
Yeah. Well, maybe take us into that a little bit. What was... You had this era of sort of tranquility. He's what, 1968 or so when he went for the first time?
That's when he went.
Okay. And then how many years until things started to get a little more difficult?
I believe it was in the 70s, 80s,
Yeah.
certainly by the 80s.
If my understanding of the history is correct, I think it was in 1976 when Guatemala suffered a devastating earthquake.
Earthquake, that's right.
And the earthquake killed tens of thousands of people, left hundreds of thousands of people homeless, substantially damaged the country's entire infrastructure. And it was called the earthquake of the poor, because those who were proportionately disaffected by it were indeed the poor, who lived in simple homes without reinforced concrete, structural supports. And it was in response to the lack of assistance that the people received following that earthquake, despite the massive international support going to Guatemala, that the people realized that the government would not take care of them. And so that really fanned into flame what was a simmering discontent and even a very small scale civil war into a major conflict.
Yeah.
So from 1976 on, the conflict became much more violent, much more prevalent, and it resulted also in a man being elected to be the president of Guatemala, who was a general and was very violent in his response, and he initiated the death squads and other types of violent reactions to the people's discontent.
Yeah. The church was in some ways stuck in the middle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The church was really the only voice that the people had to defend them. And Guatemala has a longstanding history of actually trying to minimize and actively diminish the voice of the Catholic Church. And that had been occurring for over a century.
Okay.
And so as a result of that, the church was a relatively minimized voice, but it was the only voice the people had. And when the church did speak out, the military and the government responded very harshly. And that, of course, is when the killings of priests and sisters and even the auxiliary bishop of Guatemala City was killed as part of that violent reprisal.
Anybody who would in any way seek to champion the poor, and championing the poor might consider just developing literacy programs for the poor, they would be considered enemies of the state, and that's how Father Rother ultimately became embroiled in all of this, because he was a pastor. He was caring for his flock, his people. They started a radio station. They started catechetical institutes, a school.
He put his farming knowledge to use, I understand.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and everything. He was really well equipped for the challenges that he found as a missionary at that time. But all of that attention, helping lift up the poor, instruct and catechize the faithful, make their lives a little less of a burden, brought the ire and the attention of the government and its harsh reprisals to bear upon him.
Yeah. So you've got what they call them death lists, I think, right?
Yes.
You're seeing people disappear. The auxiliary bishop was slain. Is that what you indicated? So Blessed Stanley's faced with this choice, right? And he goes home for a time. Things are sort of reaching the apex, and maybe talk about that moment of discernment. What was that like, and then what did he decide to do?
He left Guatemala reluctantly. It was in 1980, and the only way he would leave to come back to Oklahoma would be that if they could manage to get a visa for his assistant, his associate, to travel with him, because he was Guatemalan and his name was on the death list too, but he had no resources to flee the country. And at any rate, they managed to leave the country finally in 1980, the beginning of 81 actually. And it was when he got back to Oklahoma, he was like a restless cat on a hot tin roof, if you will. I mean, his brother would describe how he would catch Father Stan gazing out the back screen door of the farmhouse. He could tell that he was filled with anguish about what's happening to his people back in Guatemala, because he had spent already at this time about 13 years there, and that was his life, that was his family, those were his people, and I think there was a great deal of conflict in his heart about, did he abandon his people, and had he done the right thing, and his heart just hugging him to return, but he was being advised that it wasn't yet safe to return. So ultimately, he had to make the decision to stay or go, and as we know, the decision he made was to return, and he returned just in time for Holy Week in 1981 to face the Passion.
Yeah. Yes. And my understanding, he was there in the rectory, and they stormed the area, and maybe finish the story from there, for people can kind of hear a little bit more about what that. I mean, it seemed like a moment of intense turmoil.
So it actually started a few days before that. July 25th is the Feast of St. James. And of course, that's the patronal feast of Santiago. As the town was having their patronal feast celebration and many people were in the town square, a rumor went out that the military was going to forcibly conscript various young men, really boys, and force them into military service as part of that gathering. So many of the people of the town brought their children to Father Stanley Rother and asked that he keep them in the church for safety and protection from the military. He did open the church, and he provided safety for hundreds of children that night, and not a single one of those children was forcibly conscripted or kidnapped by the military. But that action triggered a very great wrath from the military leaders, that he would protect the people to that extent. And it was after that experience that his name did appear then on another death list. He chose to remain despite the fact that there was an imminent threat. And he actually prepared the people, especially the sisters, for the possible inevitability of his death. And he told them that if they come for him, that the sisters are to light the Easter candle and to sing Easter hymns to give the people hope in the midst of that moment. And that's indeed what they did when he was finally martyred 3 days later. 2,000 people came to the church that day to pray with his body and to pray together, and they sang Easter hymns. And that action, that preparatory action of his, actually probably prevented a violent uprising of the town against the military.
Yeah, and that love of the people for Blessed Stanley continues, right? I mean, they've got one of the most significant relics still housed in the church there.
They loved him so much. He had learned their language, for example. He identified himself so completely with their culture, with their way of life. He would go to their homes and eat their food and share meals with them. And generally, it wasn't uncommon that he would come home and spend the afternoon retching because the food was so unsanitary. And yet, he could not be deterred from sharing their life, even at such great expense. But they wouldn't hear of them allowing his body to be taken away from them. The consulate showed up the day after his death, officials from the U.S. consulate to claim his body. An American citizen had been murdered. But the people had amassed in the plaza in front of the church in such numbers that they blockaded. And so they had to negotiate. The family was contacted, and the solution was that they would perform kind of an impromptu autopsy. They removed his heart. How beautiful, the heart that he had given for his people, and they retained his heart there in Guatemala, and his body was returned to Oklahoma.
Wow.
The sisters had the foresight when they discovered his body the night that he was slain, to sop up the blood and with cloths, and then they stored them in like mayonnaise jars, and along then with the heart, which they removed, and those were placed on the altar for the first funeral mass that they had for him in Guatemala the day after, or 2 days after his death. His heart then remains in Guatemala, and his blood, the body is interred now under the altar at the shrine dedicated to his memory.
Yeah. Well, maybe talk about the just briefly what ignited the cause for the beatification? What was it that sort of prompted that? This is a few years have passed, and I had the blessing of being at the bishops' conference. I think at the time some things were being proposed to the body of bishops about it. So that's where I first heard about it.
Mm-hmm. My predecessor, Archbishop Beltran, Eusebius Beltran, had been the Bishop of Tulsa and then became the Archbishop of Oklahoma City. He knew Father Rother and kind of lived with him some of the drama of to stay or to go. So Archbishop Beltran, to his credit, recognized and was convinced from the very beginning that he had died as a martyr. And when the time was right, he introduced the cause and carried forward and completed the diocesan phase of the cause. And at the time of his retirement in 2010, I was appointed in late 2010, installed in early 2011, just as the diocesan phase had concluded, and it went on to Rome. So it was a good many years after his death, but Archbishop Beltran never gave up on seeing this through, and so he was finally beatified in 2017.
Amazing. Yeah. What does that do for a small town family? And I mean, it's got to be surreal. This is one of the things we think about the saints and blesseds in the church. We can't talk to their relatives now very often, but now there's still family in the farmhouse. We got a chance to tour they were gracious when we visited, but I saw the screen door that
he looked out.
Yes, yeah. So this has got to be strange for a family to suddenly have somebody, elevated this way as a model for us all. Did you have a sense about the buzz there in terms of the local church?
I think, I think the family was. I mean, they're a very modest family. They're not attention-seeking people. They're just ordinary rural Oklahoma farmers. And I know his sister, blood sister, Sister Marita Rother, is a door of the blood of Christ in Wichita, and they were only a year apart. They entered and on the path of their vocation the same year with one another. And I remember speaking with Sister Marita and his brother Tom later. They found it all together a bit overwhelming sometimes. And all this attention was, they knew Stan very well, and they loved him as a brother, but it was hard for them to make that switch, I think, in their minds that now the whole church, he doesn't belong to us anymore. In fact, I remember having the conversation at the time that we did a canonical recognition of the body, which means we had to exhume the body and inspect it and make sure that it was actually the body of Stanley Rother, not that it had been misplaced or switched out or something, and because the church would want to take relics from that body. And so I remember consulting with Sister Marita and making sure that she was okay with this treatment of the body of her brother. And I remember her response was, he doesn't belong to us anymore. He belongs to the church. So it was, they were kind of humbled, but they understood that this was bigger than just their own family circle now. This was for the whole church.
Yeah, which is an amazing thing. That you do have these local connected, it's, your own community maybe knows you so well that it's somewhat hard to believe that you're now in the roles, and that's a pretty amazing thing. So I'd like to talk about the shrine, but first, maybe Bishop Mueggenborg, you could take this for us. We named Blessed Stanley the patron of our Shepherd Circle, our initiative working with priests under 40, just to strengthen their ministry and vocation. Do you see Blessed Stanley as an inspiration for vocations for men looking at the priesthood? What do you think his particular patronage will be in the years ahead?
So that is a great question, and the answer is absolutely. He's a great inspiration for people who are discerning priesthood today for a variety of reasons. First, I would say because of his proximity. He grew up in American culture. He lived in a media age. He faced many of the same challenges that we do today. He was not a foreign, distant figure that we can't relate to anymore. This is a person who, had he not been martyred, would probably be still practicing his priestly ministry back in Oklahoma. And so he is truly a proximate person in the sense of a contemporary experience. We can relate to that. Secondly, I think he's inspirational because, again, he lived a very heroic witness, of his priesthood. He laid down his life for his people. When priests are ordained, they all lay prostrate on the floor of the church as we pray the litany of the saints over them. And in that moment, priests are reminded that they are dying to themselves so that they can live for Christ. And Blessed Stanley Rother really shows us what it means to live that out in a heroic way. And when you see something lived heroically, it is beautiful, it is inspirational, and it's something that awakens within, I think, especially a young man, a desire to aspire to those same heroic virtues and values. And so I think that the more seminarians do learn about his life, that it will help them focus their priesthood, and to be clear about their motives and their priorities and their values in a very challenging way. And I think it will also inspire them, to be able to pray through the difficulties that they face and the challenges that they face every day, and to remember him and his perseverance, especially his experience of seminary. As Archbishop Coakley mentioned, it was not a lack of his intellectual ability. He was an amazingly practical man. And so for him, it was, where's the use in learning Latin? How is that going to help me minister to my people? But when it came to learning the native Zulu Hill language, an unwritten native Mayan dialect, he was able to do that because that was practical, a way in which he could love and serve his people through that language. And so he was motivated by a desire for practical ministry impact.
Sure. Well, I know that when we had a chance to visit, we brought our family back within a few short months, and I particularly wanted to see how my sons reacted. They may have priestly vocations or not, but I think whatever their vocational call, living it in that self-sacrificial manner and seeing, okay, this is what it means to put it on the line for what God's asking you to do. Coming to the shrine was a beautiful thing. So maybe talk a little bit about that as we sort of wrap up here, Archbishop. How did the shrine come to be? What are you hoping to do? I think everyone should visit it, so I'll give you that plug for sure.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, at the time that we received news that Pope Francis had declared Blessed Stanley a martyr, it was December 2nd, 2016. We started immediately planning for the beatification, but just as quickly began to think, well, we need a shrine to commemorate this first American-born martyr and first American-born diocesan priest to be beatified. And so we started searching for a place to honor him suitably and thought of different possibilities. We needed, a pastoral need was to have a large church where Spanish-speaking Hispanic Catholics could gather and worship, because all of our churches that were ministering to Hispanic Catholics were too small, and it's a growing edge of our population. So we needed a big church to serve the Hispanic community. And so I decided to join the two. Stanley gave his life for Guatemalan people, Latino culture, and so we acquired a golf course, and there was 53 acres. Decided to build this church and develop this shrine on that property. We decided to architecturally to build it according to a style that would have been familiar to Stanley and the people that he had served. So we put it in kind of a Spanish colonial style architecture. I wanted something that would attract the faithful to honor the Blessed Mother, knowing that it would be the Blessed Mother who would probably introduce people to Blessed Stanley and to Jesus, as she does. So we built a tepeyac hill on the property, and to this day, I don't think I've ever driven onto the property that there haven't been people ascending or descending the tepeyac, and beautiful bronze images of Our Lady and St. Juan Diego. So we ended up building a beautiful, beautiful 2,000-seat church where the parish of Sacred Heart worships on weekends, and where pilgrims are coming from near and far from around the country to honor Blessed Stanley. He is interred in the altar of a chapel which is adjacent to the church, and it's been a great journey, and it's been already a great pilgrimage destination for many people.
And the shrine staff take wonderful care of you when you come, Miguel. Just the whole team. It was always been very hospitable.
Yeah. We have a wonderful museum, I should add, for people that want to learn more about his life. That's really to experience his life firsthand by walking through the museum, walking up Tepeyac, and finally making way to honor him at his tomb and praying before his body.
Well, sadly, we're out of time for this on-location edition of In Vino Veritas. Thank you, Bishop, for joining us. It's really been a wonderful conversation. I'm glad we're able to let people know about the life of Blessed Stanley Rother. You know, many holy people have pointed out we're given the saints for the time that we live in. There's a deep shortage of priests. We know that. So many men not in tune with what God is asking of them in their lives. But St. John Vianney made a beautiful point about how essential the priest is to us when he wrote, and I quote, "If we had not the sacrament of orders, we should not have our Lord. Who placed him there in the tabernacle? It was the priest. Who was it that received your soul on its entrance into life? The priest. Who nourishes it to give it strength to make its pilgrimage? The priest. Who will prepare it to appear before God by washing that soul for the last time in the blood of Jesus Christ? The priest. Always the priest." End of quote. I believe Blessed Stanley Rother is a patron for our time, a patron to inspire men to understand the richness of the priesthood and to answer that call. Let us turn to him as our intercessor for our church in America. Thanks again for joining us today. For more information about how the Napa Institute is forming leaders to reform the church and transform the culture, head to napa-institute.org. May God bless you this day and always.